A young shopkeeper in Seattle nearly froze to death on a winter fishing trip. He survived and built a company that carried his name for 106 years. But when that company was finally put up for auction, not one qualified bid arrived. He had already been selling outdoor gear for more than a decade when the cold nearly killed him. He had opened his own shop in Seattle in 1920 at the age of 21. Caught soaked through and freezing on that trip in Washington state, he came dangerously close to dying of hypothermia, the kind of quiet, creeping death that takes people who are simply dressed wrong for the weather. So he built what did not exist. In 1936, he patented the Skyliner, the first American jacket quilted and insulated with goose down. It was not a fashion item. It was a piece of survival equipment made by a man who had personally learned what happens when your gear fails you. That jacket and the company behind it became a name that people trusted with their lives, on mountains, in cold water, in the air. 106 years after that company was founded, in the winter of 2026, its retail operator filed for bankruptcy and began closing every remaining store across the United States and Canada. And then came the detail that says everything about how far it had fallen. The remaining stores were put up for auction. When the deadline passed, not a single qualified bid had arrived. The auction was canceled. A name that people once trusted with their lives had become something that nobody, at any price, wanted to buy. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built. The company began in 1920 in Seattle when its founder was just 21 years old, operating out of the back of a hunting and fishing store. It was not a corporation. It was a young man selling gear to people who did the same things he did, in the same weather, facing the same risks. That origin matters more than it might seem because it determined what the brand actually was. The founder was not a marketer who identified a market opportunity. He was a customer who could not find what he needed and made it himself. The down jacket existed because he had nearly frozen to death. Every design decision came from someone who would personally be wearing the thing in the conditions it was built for. The product was, in the most literal sense, a promise that had been personally tested. That is the foundation the entire brand stood on, and it is worth naming precisely. Not a logo, not a slogan, but a reputation for gear that would not fail you when failure was expensive. In outdoor equipment, that reputation is the whole business. Anyone can sew a coat. Very few names can make a person believe that the coat will hold when the temperature drops and there is nowhere to go. Over the following decades, that trust turned into a real commercial position. The company outfitted serious expeditions and supplied gear built for genuinely harsh use. Its customers were people who cared more about whether something worked than about what it cost, and who came back over and over because it had worked before. That is the most valuable kind of customer a business can have, and the hardest to earn. And here is the crucial economic point about that kind of brand, the one that explains everything that followed. Trust of this sort is an asset, but it is a strange asset. It takes decades to build, and it sits invisibly on the balance sheet if it appears there at all. It can be borrowed against. It can be rented out. And crucially, it can be spent far faster than it can ever be rebuilt. For a long stretch of the 20th century, that trust compounded. The name meant something specific and valuable, serious equipment for people who needed it to work. Customers were loyal not out of habit, but out of experience. Someone who had been kept warm by that jacket in genuinely dangerous cold did not shop around next time. They came back and they told other people. That loyalty gave the business real pricing power. It could charge more than a commodity manufacturer because it was not selling a commodity, it was selling confidence. A person buying a coat for a serious trip is not optimizing for the lowest price. They are optimizing for not being cold or worse. When your brand is the answer to that question, you occupy a position competitors cannot simply buy their way into. The company also had something rarer still, coherence. What it sold, who it sold to, and what it stood for were all the same thing. The gear was built for a specific customer with a specific need, and that customer knew it. There was no gap between the story and the product because the story had come out of the product, not the other way around. It is worth pausing on how unusual that is, because most companies never achieve it. Coherence of that kind cannot be bought or advertised into existence. It has to be earned one honest product at a time, over years, by an organization that keeps saying no to the things that would dilute it. The restraint is the asset. Every time a company with a strong name declines to put that name on something cheaper or unrelated, it is making a deposit. Every time it says yes for the sake of a quarter, it is making a withdrawal. For decades, this company mostly said no, and that discipline, invisible on any financial statement, was the real product. But an asset that valuable eventually attracts attention from people who did not build it. A brand with deep customer trust is to an investor a kind of stored value, a thing that can be acquired, borrowed against, licensed, or repositioned. And that is precisely what began to happen. The story of the next 50 years is not the story of a company being beaten by a competitor. It is the story of an asset changing hands again and again. In 1968, the founder retired and sold the company to his business partner. That single transaction is the hinge of the entire story, though nobody could have known it at the time. The man whose near death had produced the product, whose judgment defined what the brand would and would not put its name on, was gone. From that moment forward, everyone who owned the company would be someone who had bought it rather than built it. What followed was a procession. In 1971, the brand was acquired by General Mills, a food company. In 1988, it was sold again, this time to Spiegel, a catalog retailer. Consider what that means practically. A business whose entire value rested on gear expertise was now owned first by people who made packaged foods, and then by people who ran a mail-order catalog. Neither was in the business of nearly freezing to death and designing a better coat about it. This is where the mechanism at the heart of this story becomes visible, and it applies far beyond one clothing company. When a heritage brand is bought by an owner from a different industry, the brand stops being the output of a craft and starts being an input to a financial plan. The question in the boardroom quietly changes. It stops being, what should this product be? And becomes, how much can we get out of this name? And a trusted name will answer that second question generously for a while. You can put it on more products. You can extend it into cheaper lines. You can sell it through more channels to more customers at more price points. Every one of those moves converts a little bit of accumulated trust into immediate revenue, and none of them look like damage on a quarterly report. The erosion is invisible precisely because the name still works, right up until it doesn't. The tragedy of this pattern is that it is not obviously wrong at any single step. No individual decision to broaden the line or add a channel is reckless. It is the accumulation, over decades and across a series of owners who each hold the asset only temporarily, that hollows the thing out. Nobody who owns a brand for a few years is incentivized to spend heavily rebuilding trust that will mostly pay off for whoever owns it next. The financial consequences arrived in waves. In 2003, Spiegel filed for bankruptcy, and the pieces of the business were broken up. What remained was reorganized in 2005 into a new holding company built around the Eddie Bauer name. Then in 2009, that company filed for bankruptcy as well, the second failure in 6 years. Out of that process, the brand was bought by a private equity firm, Golden Gate Capital. Each of these events did something subtle and cumulative. A bankruptcy does not just restructure debt. It interrupts investment, scatters institutional knowledge, and puts survival ahead of craft. And each new owner arrived with a shorter time horizon than the last, holding an asset they intended to eventually sell rather than a company they intended to keep. The final stage was the most telling. In 2021, the brand was acquired by Authentic Brands Group together with Spark Group, owners whose model is built around licensing. Under that approach, the company that owns the name is not primarily the company that runs the stores. The name is licensed out, and the retail operation is somebody else's job. The brand had completed its long transformation from a maker of gear into a piece of intellectual property to be rented. Later, the retail operator would sit inside Catalyst Brands, formed by merging Spark with J.C. Penney, itself bought out of bankruptcy by 2 large mall landlords. Meanwhile, the customer relationship that had been the entire foundation was quietly coming apart on the ground. As the retail footprint shifted toward outlet malls, a gap opened between the brand's core customer, older, more affluent, buying on reputation, and the typical outlet shopper, who is there for a discount. Chasing the cheaper customer to fill stores meant slowly becoming less relevant to the customer who had made the name valuable in the first place. Add the supply chain damage that followed the pandemic, persistent inflation, and a pullback in discretionary spending on outdoor apparel, and the position became untenable. In February of 2026, the retail operator filed for Chapter 11. The company had entered that year with roughly 220 stores, By then, 174 remained across the United States and Canada, and the decision was made to close all of them. A brand founded in 1920 would end its North American retail presence 106 years later. It is easy to read a number like that and lose what it describes. 174 stores is 174 sets of keys, staff rooms, and long-serving employees who knew their regular customers by name. Retail closures of this kind land hardest on the people furthest from the decision, the sales floor, not the boardroom. And they land on customers too in a quieter way, the people who had bought their coats in the same place for 30 years, who trusted a name because it had never let them down, and who now watch it disappear from the street without ever having been consulted about any of the ownership decisions that led there. And then the last act, which is the part that lingers. The remaining stores were put up for auction, scheduled for the 6th of March. Before the bidding deadline 3 days earlier, not one qualified bid had been submitted. The auction was called off for lack of interest. In the end, the market was asked to place a value on what remained of a name that people had once trusted with their lives in the cold, and the market's answer was silence. It would be easy to blame the ending on the obvious external things. The pandemic, inflation, the brutal decade retail has endured. Those were real, and they were the immediate cause of the final filing. But they are not sufficient as an explanation, because plenty of outdoor brands faced exactly the same conditions and are still standing. The deeper cause was set in motion decades earlier, and it had nothing to do with the weather in the economy. What died here was not a product line. It was the alignment between a name and a promise. This company's entire value came from one thing, the belief that its gear would not fail you when it mattered. That belief was not created by marketing. It was created by a man who nearly died and then solved the problem that almost killed him. Once ownership passed to people who had bought the name rather than lived the problem, the promise could only be spent, never replenished. And this is the warning worth carrying beyond this one company, because it is happening constantly and quietly across the economy. Brand trust is borrowed from your customers, and it is the most spendable asset a business owns. You can convert it into revenue very quickly, new lines, new channels, cheaper products, more outlets, and each conversion feels like growth. But every one of those transactions is a withdrawal from an account that only decades of doing right by customers can refill. A series of owners, each holding the asset briefly, will almost always withdraw faster than anyone deposits. Once you know to look for this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. A famous name appears on a product that clearly was not made to the old standard. A heritage label turns up in a discount bin. A brand you associated with one specific kind of excellence is suddenly attached to a dozen unrelated categories. Each of those is a signal that somebody has decided to convert reputation into revenue. Sometimes the business survives it and rebuilds. Often it does not, because the customers who cared most are the first to notice, and the least likely to come back once they have been given a reason to doubt. The jacket still worked. The name was still famous. But when the moment came to ask the market what all of it was actually worth, nobody raised a hand. The brand still exists as intellectual property, licensed and owned. What ended was the store, the shelf, and the relationship. 106 years of accumulated trust turned out to be, in the end, exactly as durable as the last owner's reason for holding it. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It describes a corporate bankruptcy, a retail wind down, and a series of lawful ownership and business decisions, based on publicly available filings and reporting from credentialed sources. It makes no allegation of criminal wrongdoing by any individual or company. Source links are provided above.